following on from what Mohammed was just saying, or not. What's happened there? There we go. So there are 4 million scrounging families in Britain. There's a £28 billion bill for the work-shy. Scroungers are living in mansions, and Ribena's free. So this is what a certain section of the media tells us. And if you've never needed the safety net of benefits, maybe you would think that this is what living on benefits is like, that they're enough to provide you with a comfortable life that is therefore a disincentive to ever find work. Now, at the Centre for Research and Social Policy, we conduct focus groups with members of the public to reach a consensus about the goods and services people need to reach a socially acceptable standard of living in the UK. We ask our participants to consider the needs of particular household types and identify the essentials that everyone should have in order to be part of society. The formations of households included in our research cover up to just over 80% of households in the UK. That's most families with children and childless adults. After detailed deliberation, groups arrived at an agreed basket of items that people in the UK must be able to afford in order to achieve the minimum standard of living, to have the opportunities and choices necessary to participate in society, as was decided by our early groups who came up with this definition of a minimum income standard for the UK. So to give you an idea, our most recent research found that people thought that these items should be included. So that might not be how it works on a Mac. We've got a little animation. Or you could just use your imagination about these. There we go. So we have the basics of a decent diet and clothing. We have a basic TV, computer access, a basic phone, and our groups have decided that everyone should have a minimum of 1 UK holiday a year. What's not included at the moment is foreign travel. That's consistently been thought to be above the minimum. Cable and satellite TV, and recently it was decided that people don't need landlines. So we then take the basket of items, and after consulting experts on nutritional standards and fuel consumption, we calculate the minimum income each household would need to attain each week in order to meet the cost of those needs. We update this on an ongoing basis with adjustments for inflation every year and a review or a rebase based on groups' decisions about changes in society every 2 years. So here you can see a breakdown of the sort of costs we're talking about. You can see differences between the types of household. Most obviously, our groups have decided that only parents need a car. So for each of our households, we have a total minimum income standard, and for single people of working age, that's £282.29 a week. For a pensioner couple, that's £350.24. For a couple with 2 children, it's £742.53. And for a lone parent with 1 small child, it's £545.12. And above those figures that I've just read out, you can see the headline figures that I'll come back to later that talk about disposable income after rent and childcare costs. So can benefits cover these costs? Well, this chart shows what's happened to the level of means-tested benefits for people not working relative to minimum income standards since 2008, and projects what will happen in the present Parliament under the cuts to benefit spending that are promised. As you can see, there's a vast difference depending on whether we're talking about pensions or other benefits. And if we take our 2 groups of families with children, the adequacy of benefits has already fallen significantly. They provided enough for about 2/3 of a minimum required budget in 2008, but now only provide about 57%. And you can see that following this scenario, there'll be a gradual continuation of this trend. And this projection is based on the freeze on working age benefits that was put in place this year, which will see single claimants struggling on just 35% of what they need for an acceptable standard of living in 2020, and families down to half a minimum income standard budget. Of course, benefits are not just safety nets relied upon by those who are unemployed or retired. Even if you're not claiming job seekers allowance, you may still rely on housing benefit, child tax credit, working tax credit, income support, or employment and support allowance. And universal credit's being introduced to cover all these payments, and it's already been salami sliced before it's been rolled out. In cutting benefits for both out of work and employed people, the government has lowered the earnings threshold at which people are cut off from state support. This position has been defended by ministers such as Jeremy Hunt, who suggested that working parents can make up for this shortfall simply by working longer hours, like the Chinese. But Donald Hirsch, director of the Centre for Research and Social Policy, has worked out that in order to achieve the same net income in 2016 as in 2015, after the cuts, a lone parent working 30 hours a week on the minimum wage, that's the government's national living wage, would need to work 45 hours a week. And that's even before any extra childcare costs that would then kick in is taken into account. So let's look at the risks of falling below an acceptable living standard for people in various employment categories. Now I'm going to take two examples of working age households without children, and perhaps you've already guessed, but in both cases it's those in the out of work category who are most at risk of falling below an acceptable minimum income. Here we can see how the risk of low income has risen from 54% to 76% for couples without children who have no work. The picture for young singles on their own is even more bleak, with the risk of being on a very low income, that's not being able to meet more than 50% of their needs, rising from 45% to 58% for those who are not in paid work. I'm showing you these two graphs because these are the two groups for whom the changes over time have been most stark. But the picture for almost all our other households is equally disturbing. The proportion of unemployed lone parents who are below minimum income standards has remained at around 90% since 2008. For unemployed couples with children, this figure has risen from 83% to 92% over the 5 years. What all our research shows is that by far the greatest risk of having insufficient income is borne by households where there's no adult in work. The risk of low income generally decreases as the overall amount of work in the household increases. You can see that less than 10% of couples where both are in work, or where one is in work and full-time and one has some work, are at risk of being below minimum income standard. And you can see that bottom blue line, it's around 2% for those where both are employed. So do we imagine that the standard of living for those who are out of work and claiming benefits is so comfortable that they have no incentive to work? That these stories from the media portray an accurate representation of living on benefits? Well, let's look at the definition again that members of the British public have decided stands for a minimum income standard, and let's bear that in mind when we think about what we will accept as a standard of living in the UK. Thank you.